Hello everyone, Dr. Catalana here. The purpose of this presentation is to give you an overview of large-scale testing. So when we speak about large-scale tests, there are two main types of grading that we'll cover today, and that would be norm referenced and criterion referenced. Just to be clear, I posted an article as well as a video and your accompanying reading guide to this material. There is a lot of content here, but again, focus on the interpretation rather than memorizing all of these terms. The one thing I can guarantee you when you enter your profession as a teacher is that there will always be some new test that you don't understand. In fact, I do a lot of Googling when I'm trying to figure out how to interpret different large-scale tests. So it's really not about memorizing, it's more about applying the content even with your notes right next to you and being able to make sense of this kind of data. So these are our learning objectives for the day. The key thing that we'll focus on, the difference between individual student referenced, norm referenced, and standards referenced grading. So oftentimes we'll actually call standards referenced grading criterion referenced. I want you to know both of those terms. However, your readings and the video refer to this as criterion referenced, so I apologize for not having that in there originally. I'll talk about interpreting percentile scores, discussing the importance of using national and local norms, and then we'll have just a brief moment to discuss reliability and validity here. So before we go any further here, and I'll just give you an overview of these different types, I have got to just continually say we cannot trust one test score. So oftentimes when we're looking at large-scale assessments, we forget that those assessments are attached to a student, and that student has a life, that student has their own unique challenges and unique strengths, and so it's important that we don't define our students based on how they do on one test, right? Very few people like tests. You're going to get nervous. One thing we've talked about consistently this semester is reliability. When we have that internal noise, we won't perform as well as we could. So it's important that we take that really to heart when we're looking at these large-scale assessments. Okay, so this is just an overview of the three types. Your readings did not go into individual student referenced. I actually find this very helpful, so I wanted to touch on it. So individual student referenced is just as it sounds. You are comparing the student to themselves. Grade is based on comparison with the student's prior performance. So this is when you're asking students to trace their own growth. I think individual student reference scoring is one of the most powerful teaching tools. So having students chart their progress, this doesn't have to be with academic data, it can also be with behavioral data. This is very important for that growth mindset. If you have students that are perfectionists, that are struggling, I've actually had my students chart their reactions to incorrect answers. So I've used this tool to kind of support students in receiving constructive feedback. Also a great tool for a special education setting. Anytime you really want to focus that student on his or her personal growth. So the main two that we'll focus on are norm referenced and criterion referenced. Norm referenced is when we're comparing students to each other. So students are compared to each other's performance. How do they measure up to each other? Now there is a place for this in education, not very often in your individual classroom, unless you're doing it for the child's benefit, in the sense of like, I'm comparing students to each other so I can differentiate. So within the classroom, I do very little norm reference grading. I really don't care how Josh does in comparison to Amber. That's really not of importance to me. I want to know, how is Amber doing in comparison to Amber? Okay, and the last is your criterion reference grading. This is how the student work is compared to a predetermined standard of mastery. So we'll go deeply into these last two but I did want to touch on individual student reference so you can get an understanding of that. Okay, so criterion reference grading, again, often referred to as standards-based tests. Not really the same thing, but for our purposes, that's fine. And here's your image. Just kind of keep this in mind. You are looking at how well the student measures up to a predetermined standard. Most of my assessments, if not all that I've given you, are criterion referenced. For example, your quizzes, right? You can earn up to 10 points on your quizzes. So I'm comparing you to those 10 possible points. So again, how does the student measure up? Policymakers identify the key standards that are essential for the students to learn. That's why we often call these standards-based. Criterion reference grading is definitely going to determine if students have attained that knowledge that is spelled out in these standards. In other words, like an end-of-course exam, there are certain things that you should have learned by the end of a course. So I am measuring your knowledge on what I have predetermined that it's important that you know. Most criterion reference grading is specific to a skill or specific to a content. So again, how well do you measure up to what you are expected to know? Okay, so these various graphs are coming directly from your article that I gave you. I wanted to talk through them because they look intimidating. Again, I always joke that I teach assessment, but I'm not really a math person. And I think it's important just to kind of dig through what these kind of graphs mean because it should not intimidate you. You guys are all very apt in terms of being educators, and I know that because you have a heart for what you're doing. So don't let things like this intimidate you. The key here, again, criterion reference, so I'm comparing the students to a predetermined standard. For example, in your quiz, you can get up to 10 points, right? In this kind of test, one student's score is not affected by their peers' performance, right? So theoretically, and oftentimes this does happen, everyone in class could get 10 out of 10 on your quiz, right? So the fact that Sydney gets 10 out of 10 doesn't affect whether or not Zatea can also get 10 out of 10, right? So theoretically, the entire class can score 10 out of 10. So all these graphs are showing us this green line right here. This is just separating whether or not the student is below or above proficiency. Okay, so if you look at these three graphs, all three of the scores are the same. So let's just name this dude Gerard. Why not? Gerard here, his score is 40. Gerard's score here is 40. And Gerard's score here is 40. So 40 is below proficient. So he's below proficient in all three of the situations. And what this is showing here is, check this out, Gerard's score was the top of the entire class. However, he still scored below proficient. Here, Gerard's score, he was kind of average compared to the rest of the class, but again, he's still below proficient. Here, he's the lowest in the class, and again, he's still proficient. So what this is showing you is that Gerard, the light blue dude, his scores have nothing to do with the rest of the class. It's the same way with your scores on your quizzes, right? So let's say a 6 out of 10, that would be a 60. So we'll call that below proficient. Now, theoretically, you could earn a 60 and everybody else scored below a 60. But hey, your 60 is still below average, right? Now in that situation, I may change, actually I would just look at an item analysis. But the point is that Gerard's score here is not impacted by how the rest of the students in the class are doing. So a couple of standards-based tests that you have seen. I want you to kind of think through this. Again, these should be directly related to a specific content where you're holding students accountable to their standards that they should have learned. So a couple of examples you've probably seen, either taken or seen in the field. The South Carolina Ready, South Carolina Pass, again, guys, always changing. So I would never ask you to memorize how to interpret these specific tests. I would just want you to have a general base knowledge of test analysis. And then, of course, your EOC tests. So I'm sure that as high schoolers, you were very aware of those EOC tests where at the end of biology, you would take the biology end of course exam. Now, you would not expect to see any history questions on the biology EOC. That's because it's really specific to your content. So in the next presentation, we'll talk about looking at various score reports. So I wanted to show you an example here, right? So a couple things to look at. I know pretty much immediately that this is a criterion referenced test in the way that it's being assessed. And the biggest thing for me is that I see these categories down here and it's labeled your student's performance, right? So let's just keep with the name Gerard. This is how Gerard did, and I have no idea how his peers did. So the fact that I'm looking at just Gerard's performance and that I see these categories, these are often called proficiency levels of low, middle, high, that shows me I am comparing my students to this predetermined standard of scoring really high. So this is telling me it's a criterion referenced test in terms of how it is scored. This is actually an example of, I think it's one of the South Carolina, can't remember which one it is, but we'll actually look at this during the next presentation and work through some questions in terms of analysis here. But I wanted to cover a couple of things here. First off, what is the highest score the student can receive? Right here. The highest score they can receive is a 1930. So there's your kind of predetermined standard. Another hint, this is criterion referenced. Now, another hint, here's his performance level or proficiency level. Overall, he is meeting expectations. Okay? So one thing to definitely point out here is this arrow. Your student's scale score is indicated by an arrow. Now, you should be asking yourself, oh my God, wait, what's a scale score? You know what? Right now, it doesn't matter. So what I want you to do is get used to seeing terms you're not familiar with, but not turning away. That doesn't mean you can't make sense of it. So your student's scale score is indicated by an arrow. If your student were to test again under similar circumstances, his or her score would likely remain in the following range, 1855 to 1865. Okay, so if you were to take it again in similar scenarios, you would either be 5 below or 5 above that score. That right there is reliability, right? So consistency is so important with these tests. You will often have parents come in and say, well, would he do better if he took it again? And what this is saying is under similar circumstances, meaning he doesn't prepare anymore, it's a similar day, blah, 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 then his score wouldn't really change that much. Okay? The reason I like these kind of tests is now I can look even more specifically and notice where's the one area I really want to encourage Gerard in, and it's right here, forces in motion, right? So as the teacher, the reason I like these large-scale tests is because it informs my teaching, okay? So I can look and say, ooh, this is where I can help, right? I'm not saying, oh, Gerard, can't believe you're low over here. You know, you're not learning anything. What I'm seeing is an opportunity for me as the educator. Another common one you'll see is a benchmark assessment. So benchmarks determine student status on achieving the year-end standard. I like these because it's kind of like a stepping stone. Okay, this helps me see what kind of remediation I need to provide and also challenge. So really, the purpose of this presentation, guys, I'm just exposing you to a lot of this. If and hopefully when you choose to take my more advanced assessment course, we'll go more deep into these. But I just want to make sure you have an overview of a few. One that several of you have probably seen in the field is Fontes and Pinnell. This is a benchmark assessment for reading level. Okay. So you've probably seen something like this before, where you're categorizing exceeds, meets, approaches, and does not meet expectations. And this is just showing you the gradual growth from grade K, grade 1, 2, 3. Okay. Now, in your methods classes, you will 100% look into, oh my gosh, what in the world does this mean, right? For now, I just want you to know that these are instructional level expectations. This is for reading. And mainly, I just wanted to give you another name for a benchmark assessment. So benchmark assessment is measuring student performance throughout the year. So it's like your stepping stones to get from first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, end of year. Okay, I like these because you can trace growth, and that's really helpful. So I actually use these for formative purposes. Okay, again, criterion reference grading compares students to a predetermined standard. So how do you measure up? Now, that's a lot of information. Again, right here, this is your key, predetermined standard. Every single one of you can score a 100. There's no limit to that. Okay, so now let's talk about norm reference grading. So norm reference is when we are comparing students to each other, right? So this hilarious comic right here, the cookie saying, you guys are so much cooler than me, because they're ice cream. You know you miss me. Okay, so norm reference grading. How do the students compare to each other? So here's your image to kind of think of. Sweet little girl is not really comparing to how tall this girl is. Okay, so how do students measure up in comparison to each other? So again, this is directly from your reading. On a norm reference test, an individual student's rank is calculated according to the performance of their peers. Okay, so we're back with Gerard, although he's changed color. So maybe this is his sister. I don't know. Gina. This is Gina, Gerard's sister. All right, so she scores a 40. This is her raw score. She scores a 40 in each of these scenarios. Her score is 40, 40, and 40. So her score is not changing, but her percentile is. So check this out. In this class, her score of 40, let's say this is first period, she scored the highest. Okay, so she scored the same or better than 97% of the students who took the test. That's how I would interpret that percentile. Now, let's say this is second period. Now, second period, she also scored a 40, same raw score, but now she's kind of just chilling. So she's actually kind of in the lower portion here. So if her score is 38th percentile, she scored the same or better than 38% of the students that took the test. Okay, and now in third period, poor Gina here, same score of a 40, except for now she is the actual lowest score in this case. So her score, her raw score doesn't change. However, her percentile changes. And this is one of those scenarios that's really frustrating, right? So think back, this is not that long ago, as you were applying to Winthrop. I'm not sure exactly what the criteria is right now, but a common metric that universities want to know is, what is your class rank? So are you in the top 10? Are you in the top 5? Are you in the top 50%? Right? So that is comparing your score or your GPA to the rest of the students. Well, automatically you should be like, wait a second, that's not very fair. Because what if Gina went to this school where it was kind of easy and she automatically scored higher than everyone else, but if she had to transfer her senior year, she's scoring the same raw score, but now she's with all these smarty pants over here. Okay, so norm reference, it completely matters how the rest of the class did. So how do you compare to all of the other students? And there is a place for this in the classroom. This is more so used at like a large scale, in the sense of looking for like the students that different universities want to accept into their freshman class. Now, I won't go into this. There are methods, like fancy statistics, things that we can do to try to correct this, in the sense of your rank being corrected so that if you went to a, quote, harder school, you would still have an equal chance as if a student went to a, quote, easy school. But your point of this slide is your same raw score, but your percentile changes. Okay, so this was when we are ranking students. Is it really a good idea to compare students to each other? So I'm sure I would have a very heated discussion if we had the opportunity to be in class. Most likely you're saying, I don't know. This is what we know as our normal distribution, right? So a normal distribution is going to limit the amount of people who are up top. Okay? So the issue here is that professors are kind of like forcing their scores to be in this normal distribution. A lot of professors will say they are curving their scores. That does not actually mean they're putting them onto this bell curve. Usually when professors say they're curving, they're just adding points to everyone. So if the highest grade was a 90, then they are adding 10 points to every of the student scores. That is a somewhat common practice, but actually that's not curving. Curving would mean that I would force my grades into this distribution. And really we don't want to do that, because that's like me forcing only 2 potential A's, no matter what the actual raw score is. So think for a second. I know I'm doing the awkward pause thing where we're not actually in class. When would you want to use norm reference grading? Okay, so this is within your classroom. There are a few situations where we would want to use norm reference grading in the classroom. You have to remember this is limiting the amount of students who can be at the top. So I will use norm reference grading if I have a limited number of slots for something. So for my music people, so for Terrence and for Will, you can only have one first chair, right? So I have to compare the students to each other because I only have one chair to fill. If my students are preparing for field day, right? I used to love field day. And you want to do the 50-yard dash. Well, obviously, I'm going to choose the fastest person in my class to run for the 50-yard dash. So I don't really care how fast you are. I just care that you are my fastest option. And I can only nominate one, so there's my limited number of slots. So in that case, I would use norm reference grading in my classroom. You can also use norm reference grading in the classroom if you want to differentiate for readiness. Okay, so this teacher right here has 1, 2, 3 groups. He probably organized those groups based on readiness. So of course he's going to compare students there. But again, it's for their benefit. So I'm not saying, oh man, look at how you scored in comparison to this other person. Really what I'm saying is what's the most effective way to group you and best serve your needs. Okay, so norm reference grading does have its place in the classroom, not as common. The majority of things that I do in the classroom are criterion referenced. So norm reference grading are typically things like the SAT, the COGAT is an intelligence test, and the ACT. Okay, so these are various different tests that you're probably familiar with. Definitely ACT and SAT you've taken before or at least heard of, right? So norm reference tests are typically used to make placement decisions. So I wouldn't really use norm reference grading beyond these scenarios in my classroom, but at a large scale, it is important to use them for more like placement decisions. One thing to note, guys, this is not always the case. There are several Ivy League schools that don't depend on norm reference tests like SAT, ACT. That's for a lot of reasons. Number one being you can totally play the game of these tests and just have perfect scores. I am a fan of not using these tests for issues of bias, but you do need to know how they're used. Okay, these often cover achievement or aptitude. So achievement tests specific content. Aptitude tests kind of like your general capability. Okay, this was not in your reading, but I do just kind of want you to see the difference here. So aptitude tests often have these random patterns and stuff. And what this is trying to get at is your general knowledge. Achievement tests are trying to get at content specific. So the big question, who is this norm group? So I love this picture. We use this in ACAD. This is a map of a map of our country based on the business that each state is most well known for. So congratulations, South Carolina. You got Denny's. Charlotte, where I am, Bank of America. Totally true. I live really close to Uptown Charlotte. So Bank of America is kind of taking over everything. And the reason I bring this up is to show you the difference between a national norm and a local norm. So if I compare students to the national norm, this is a nationally representative sample. If I compare students to a local norm, this is a locally representative sample. So what this means, if I look at a national norm, such as your ACT, SAT, basically what that means is I'm comparing this student here in South Carolina, his or her performance, to the student over here in California, or the student over here in Alaska, or Hawaii. You have to think about your internal, external noise there. I'm sorry, but it's really different to live in South Carolina versus Washington versus Texas versus Maine or Florida. So national norms are comparing the entire country. Remember that education is state-based, right? So not everyone uses Common Core standards. So not everyone is learning the exact same thing. So it's kind of like apples to oranges when we do national norms. I'm a huge fan of local norms, which is a more locally representative sample. So that would be comparing students in South Carolina to each other. You can even go as small as like the district. One thing that I really advocate for in education is using local norms to nominate students for gifted programs, right, to make sure that we are serving all of our students. Okay, so your big takeaway here is, are we comparing students nationally or locally? So when you are a teacher, guys, you need to look at that and say, what does this 38th percentile mean? Because if it's comparing little Susie here to Jimmy up here, you want to take that with a grain of salt, right? So do you really care national norm? Again, this is what colleges want. They want to know who's the cream of the crop from the entire country. So that's kind of where the national norm comes in. Here's an example of a norm referenced score, a norm referenced test, right? So this is I think this is the ACT Aspire, if I remember correctly. The big hint for me to know that this is norm referenced is I see these percentiles. So this student is in the 96th percentile on a nationally representative sample, which is really good. That means they scored the same or better than 96% of the students who took the test, right? And then if I look at their sub-scores, they were 96th percentile for reading and writing and 94th percentile for math. Again, that score range, there's your reliability. So my scores range from 660 to 720. If I took it again, I would be in this range, okay? Believe it or not, there are people who work with standardized tests for their living, and they want a really quality reliability, so they work hard to keep this a really narrow or small difference. Okay, so again, these percentiles scored the same or better than 96% of the students who were tested. Now, you could flip that and say the student was in the top 4%. Oftentimes I find that when I'm doing like a parent-teacher conference, parents will understand that more effectively. It's actually not mathematically correct, but for our purposes, it's fine. So you can flip that to say they scored the same or better than 96%, or they scored top 4%. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk through, should we trust these large-scale tests? Man, I wish we could have this discussion in class, because we would quickly say, no. At least we should not trust them alone. So we should never trust a single test score. That's where your triangulation comes in. There are definitely issues with reliability and validity. Okay, so just a couple of examples. Imagine that this whole bowl of marbles are all of the things that you've learned throughout the year. Those are all of the standards. And then this handful is what's tested. So when we think about validity, right, am I measuring all of your knowledge, or am I just measuring your knowledge of what happened to be tested? Now, there are efforts, trust me, to make sure that what's tested is representative of all the standards, but it can never be perfect. So that's one thing to think about in terms of validity. Also, what's it like to take these tests, guys? It's boring. Everyone covers up all the pretty things on the walls. The proctor reads the same thing over and over again. You use your number 2 pencil. That doesn't stress us out at all, right? So there's a lot of internal noise that goes on. A lot of us just aren't good test takers. So again, we don't trust that one score. Okay, so if you remember nothing else from this presentation, remember, don't ever make a judgment based on that single score. Do not label your students. There's so much more to them than what they score on a test that is not perfect, a test that can easily be biased, and a test that was created by people who can easily not even realize that they have those biases. So last thing I want to give you is this slide. This is just a really good summary on the differences between criterion referenced and norm referenced. Okay, so simple definition differences and some real world examples. That will be really helpful as you complete your reading guide for the week. Okay, I know that this is a little bit more of a long-winded presentation, but there is a lot of important content here, and I wanted to make sure I could explain it as effectively as possible. I hope you guys have a wonderful day, and please stay safe.